questions on any of that? Okay, great. Okay, good. So here we have Charles Hill. Great. Thank you so much for joining us here. We can't hear you yet. There you go.
You're welcome. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be here, virtually.
I'm going to turn the camera around so that you can see the student.
Okay.
Great. Hi. Yeah, you guys can talk too.
Okay.
Great. Good. And so I'll stand behind you guys. So Charles, you just want to introduce international business to us and talk to us a little bit about why it's important at this stage to study international business?
Ingrid, I can't quite hear you. So if you're asking me to speak.
Sorry. Our video here is not as sophisticated as I was hoping, but okay, great. So would you like to talk to the students a little bit about why you think it's important to study international business today?
Well, sure, I will. So you can make a couple of points. I won't take a lot of your time up. But the first point I want to make is I think you're taking intrinsically one of the most interesting classes that you can take. Because what you're doing is you're looking at the nature of the world that we live in. You're looking at differences in politics, differences in economics, and differences in culture across nations. And I think that's a very educational experience. There's an awful lot to understand about the way the world is from wherever you are originally. I mean, I'm originally from the UK. I learned a lot coming to America. But the world is a very big, very diverse place. And there's a lot to learn about how different countries operate, differences in religion, differences in politics, differences in culture, differences in economic systems. So all of that stuff is germane to this course. It's really an important central part of it. That's the first point I would make. So well done for attending this course. You've got a lot to learn. First point. Second point, I just want to make a little observation. I've been doing this stuff for a long time. I took my first international business course, actually, I took as an undergraduate, and it was probably, and I'm going to shock some of you now, I'm shocking myself, but I think it was about 1975, which is probably way before most of you were even thought about being conceived by your parents. The world has changed a lot in the last 50 years. There's a lot of water that's flown under the bridge. And in my lifetime, and this is very important for the context of the course you're about to take, there have been two very big changes that have fundamentally impacted international business, the international economy, the way the world works. The first of those changes took place in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And that was the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. That may be ancient history to you guys, but I can tell you, for those of us who lived through that, it was really profound. And it shaped what happened for the next 30 years. Because we lived in a world that was demarcated by the Berlin Wall, the Soviet bloc, China that was closed, satellite nations around China that were also closed to Western business. And all of that started to change with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the revolt against communism, the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is 89 to 90. And it opened up the world in a way that those of us who were born back in the 50s couldn't have possibly imagined. And what happened is in the next 30 years, I'm talking about the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, we lived in a world where we saw a number of things happening. Trade barriers came down. Well, let me back up. Democratic political systems started to spread around the world. Country after country moved from centrally planned socialist economies towards mixed economies or more market economies that in any event had a substantial market element to them. Price controls were abolished, state-run businesses were privatized, regulation, a lot of deregulation took place. This was all over the world. This happened in Vietnam, this happened in the United Kingdom, this happened in Brazil, this happened in Argentina, this happened in Israel, in India, this happened in Egypt. All over the world, this changed. In the 90s, it was a big thing. The World Trade Organization sort of brought all of this together. Barriers to the, as countries became more democratic, they embraced market-based economics. Barriers to cross-border trade and investment came down. Countries could suddenly source production from other countries in the world to a degree that they never could before. Countries could invest in each other's markets to a degree that they never could before. There was a shift, we call it global shift, in the way in which the world was organized. And we saw the globalization of production. We saw the globalization of markets. We saw a world that was becoming one, where we had the emergence of multilateral institutions, such as the World Trade Organization, that established rules that everybody agreed upon, that basically governed cross-border trade and cross-border foreign direct investment. And increasingly, we established this global economic system. And that global economic system drove enormous expansion of international business. Huge. Corporations dispersed their value creation activities to different locations around the globe. They entered each other's markets. The size of the markets expanded. Countries that we could never access, such as Russia and China and India, opened their borders. Brazil, Argentina. Suddenly, we were investing in each other's economies. For the United States, since we're in the United States, this was transformational. The US had always dominated in terms of foreign direct investment and multinationals, but by the time you get to the beginning of this century, it's very significant in terms of the performance of the US economy. As recently as 2015, 40% of the revenues of all firms in the S&P 500, American firms in the S&P 500, are generated outside of the United States. The wealth and prosperity of the US depends upon global markets. And that was a result of this cascade of effects that was triggered by the collapse of communism, the adoption of democratic institutions, a pivot towards market-based economies, a multilateral rules-based organization under the World Trade Organization. And all of that stuff created the world in which you were born and in which you've grown up. And it's a world that has lifted 2 billion people out of poverty. Seriously, we've seen the greatest reduction, this is according to the World Bank, we've seen the greatest reduction in human poverty in history because of the economic growth. That's the result of free trade, lower barriers to foreign direct investment, a multilateral rules-based system governing that under the World Trade Organization, and everything else that follows from that. And it's been a fascinating thing to watch. And for international businesses, it's been a fascinating environment in which to operate and expand. And we've seen this shift in terms of firms from being multi-domestic. I operate this way in this market, this way in this market, this way in this market, to becoming more global in their enterprises, in their organization. And that's been a huge change. And it all changed again about 2015, 16. We saw Brexit. We saw the election of Donald Trump. And I'm not making a political statement here. But both Brexit and Trump's election were really about retrenchment. They were about pulling back from globalization. And that was the beginning of a pretty significant shift that we're now living through. We've seen trade barriers go up. We've seen the United States put barriers, 25% tariffs on imports from China. We've seen the United Kingdom withdraw from Brexit and withdraw from the European Union. Why does this matter? Well, the United States and the UK were the two prime architects after World War II of this global system that I've just been talking about. And we've moved back from that to a certain degree. And other things have happened. We now talk about China as a competitor. We used to talk about them as a cooperator and the biggest potential market for our goods and services and a source for a lot of production. They still are. But at the same time, to a degree that we never used to think about it, we're now thinking about it as competition as well. So that's a shift. We have seen greater nationalism across the West, the United Kingdom and the United States, but also in countries like, for example, Italy, France, Holland, where nationalist populist parties have gained power. So there's been a shift in the macro environment that's been accompanied by growing protectionism, growing trade barriers, and a diminishment of the power of the World Trade Organization. In other words, this multilateral rules-based organization is falling apart. And just in case you get the wrong message here, even though the Trump administration started this in the United States, the Biden administration is going straight down the same path. So what does this mean? And a couple of other things I should mention in passing, because I know I'm taking too much time up here, Ingrid. I should mention the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has really upset the geopolitical scene. And all of a sudden, we're no longer living in the bucolic 2010s or the 1990s. We're living in the third decade of the 21st century that looks a little bit like the 1970s. We're back to something that's not exactly a Cold War, but it's not one of cooperation and investing in each other's markets. People are pulling out of Russia very fast. We have China, the second largest economy in the world, that is now trying to establish itself as its own economic center of gravity, that is establishing ties and relationships with other countries around the world through something called its Bridge and Belt. Have I got that right, Ingrid? Belt and Road Initiative. And all of this stuff is really very interesting, and it's changing the environment in which international businesses operate. And that's important for you guys taking this course, because it's never been more challenging and more interesting.
Right. Exactly.
And, you know, if you're an international business, you're now playing on a different playing field than you were 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. The world has shifted. It ain't going back anytime soon. That doesn't mean that international business is not very important. It's going to be profoundly important. I'm going to give you one statistic, Ingrid, and then I'm going to shut up. But I'm going to give you one more statistic that I want you to think about. Actually, I think I gave you this already. Anyway, over 40% of the revenues of firms in the S&P 500 are generated outside the United States. Think about that. Do we really want to live in a world that's segmented into different spheres of influence by trade barriers and all the rest of it? What's that going to do to those firms? What's that going to do to the stock market? What's that going to do to employment opportunities? Something to chew on. Anyway, I think it's a fascinating time to study international business. Congratulations to all of you being in this course. I'm going to leave it at there, Ingrid. I think I've probably spoken for more than enough. Enjoy.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask real quick, does anybody have a question for Dr. Hill? No, Shane has a question.
You may have to translate this for me because I'm very hard of hearing and he's way back there.
No problem. Okay.
So I take it you're a big proponent of globalism. I think it's really interesting how you mentioned that we will lose a lot of value from exports if we don't have globalism. Would you say that we wouldn't recapture some of that by products that we would be selling internally instead of having as imports?
Yeah, I didn't quite catch that, Shane. So I'm going to let Ingrid pass that question on to me. I heard something about colonialism, which gave me hives.
What is it? Globalism.
Oh, globalism.
Right, exactly, right.
Thank God for that. Carry on.
Right, yeah, and he was just saying, and I think in the book we refer to it as globalization, right? But
Yes.
globalization.
Yeah.
And right, so Shane was saying that if it, if we do move forward, like Trump or Biden recommends, and we kind of start to, produce more things inside, could there be like a positive side to this as well?
Okay, so it's a very good question. So
we lose a lot of value from exports because we wouldn't get exported as much, but
yeah, I can't quite hear you, Shane, but I'm going to interject anyway, and I'm going to give you my little take on this, and I think you're getting at the notion of is globalization all that it's cracked up to be, and is it all good?
Well,
there we go. Okay.
I was saying, I think you were saying, 40% of our economy comes from global exports, and we would be losing that. But would we be recapturing some of that from, instead of having imports, we're doing business with ourselves a bit more.
Okay, so this is why I'm very glad that you're taking this course.
Yeah.
Because it may disabuse you of that notion. Look, here's the thing: trade is good. There's theoretical reasons for believing that, and there's empirical reasons, and there's decades of experience that by engaging in international trade, what we do is specialize in the production of things that we're very good at producing, while importing things that we're not so good at producing from other countries. There's a lot of theoretical work and a lot of empirical work that goes back to Adam Smith that basically says that trade is how we grow economies, how we make people prosperous, how we lift people out of poverty. This notion that somehow we should shut ourselves off from the world, basically what it is going to mean is that you are going to lose the gains that come from trade. And it's not clear to me that you can replace that by trying to let me back up. I mean, imagine you're probably wearing clothes that were made in Costa Rica or Bangladesh. We all are, okay? And the issue is that, okay, that's allowed for by lower barriers to trade and all the rest of it. If we start to produce more clothes in South Carolina like we used to do, what's going to happen? Well, the price of your clothes is going to go up because costs are higher and we're not as efficient as that in South Carolina. That means you have less money to spend on other goods and services. So not only are you going to spend more on clothes because they're going to cost more, you won't have as much to spend on your iPhone or your apps or anything else that you want to buy. And so your level of economic wealth is going to go down. So what I'm advocating, and it's not me, right? This is the dominant position of most people who are schooled in international trade and economics going back 200 years, which you will learn, going back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo, is that trade is a positive sum game. It's not a competition. It's not we get that and you get that from a fixed pie. It's about growing the pie so that everybody is better off. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be losers. The textile workers in South Carolina might lose, right? And if they lose, they're going to make a lot of noise. But here's the key, and I empathize with them. But here's the key. The gains outweigh the losses and net welfare goes up. Now, if I was really going to explain it to you, I'd be taking all of Ingrid's airtime and we'd be here for the next 2 hours. And I don't want to do that. So it's in the book. It's a great question, by the way. It's a great question.
Those are some very good points. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, no, you're more than welcome. But it's in the book. Ingrid will teach you this, I'm sure. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, I feel like that's a great summary of the course. I feel like we're done with the course now, right? We can just start.
No, you're not done. You're not done. But it's a great question.
Right, exactly. It is a great question, right? Because, people are questioning it all the time, right? We're losing jobs in the United States, right? What's happening to the steel workers, et cetera. But research shows, right, that we bring everybody up when we do international
Yeah.
trade.
Yeah. Look at the reduction in poverty.
Right,
Globally.
exactly. Right, exactly. Right. Good. All right. I think we're all set. Let's go ahead and get
Well, I clap for you guys for taking this course.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to staying in touch.
You're welcome. I'm going to go and have my dinner now.
Exactly. Yeah. Bon appetit. Great.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Great. So good. That's all I have. So hopefully that really gave you a nice introduction to the course. That it's from the horse's mouth that he's another scholar and academic in international business. And he, as I said, he's been writing this textbook for about 30 years. And when I read the textbook, it really resonated with a lot of the things that I studied in my MBA, and thought that'd be a really great way, because I feel like when we read a textbook, it's kind of like, who's writing this? It's really interesting sometimes to meet the author. So hopefully you found that pretty cool. So let's go ahead and we're going to get into pairs here in just a minute. I'll assign the pairs, pretty straightforward. And we're going to go through the learning objectives and the outcomes. You're going to choose one learning objective that speaks to you. Most likely you've had some experience with this learning objective. If they're out of all the learning objectives, you've not had any experience, choose a learning objective that you'd like to have some experience in. So I'll go through all 5 with you as a bigger group. And then, as I said, we'll break up into pairs and tell your partner about that. And then your partner's going to introduce you to the class with your name and the learning objective and the experience that you chose. Questions? Okay, super. So the first learning objective says to examine globalization, as we've already been talking about, and differences in business environments across countries.